Right now, you're breathing without thinking about it. In, out. Your lungs pulling oxygen from the air, your blood carrying it to every cell in your body. It's automatic, effortless, the most basic function of being alive. But imagine if you woke up tomorrow and the air was wrong, not gone, just wrong. Thinner, harder to pull into your lungs, each breath leaving you slightly more exhausted than the last. 252 million years ago, that's exactly what happened to Earth. Except it wasn't just for a day or a week, it was for tens of thousands of years, and it killed almost everything. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking comments and seeing Tokyo at dawn, Texas at midnight, London at lunch. All of us scattered across this planet, breathing easy, while I tell you about a time when breathing wasn't easy at all. Picture this. Siberia, 252 million years ago. But not the frozen wasteland you're imagining. This is before the ice, before the tundra, when Siberia sat near the equator. And across an area larger than all of Europe, the ground is splitting open. Not in one place, everywhere. Thousands of volcanic fissures tearing through the landscape like the earth itself is unzipping. Lava doesn't just flow, it floods. Molten rock pouring out in sheets, each flow thick enough to bury a skyscraper. Layer upon layer upon layer, building up into plateaus of solidified magma that will eventually be 2 miles thick in some places. This isn't a single volcano. This is the planet hemorrhaging. The Siberian Traps, geologists call them now. Traps from the Swedish word for stairs, because the weathered lava flows look like massive stone steps. But that clinical name doesn't capture what actually happened. This was the largest volcanic event in Earth's recorded history. These eruptions continued for somewhere between 60,000 and 200,000 years. Think about that. Modern human civilization is only about 10,000 years old. The Siberian Traps erupted for potentially 20 times longer than humans have had cities, and while they erupted, the world died. 96% of all marine species, gone. 70% of land vertebrates, vanished. Insects, which had survived every previous extinction event, were devastated for the first and only time in their history. This wasn't just a mass extinction. This was the closest Earth has ever come to total sterilization. This was the event that nearly hit the reset button on complex life entirely. Scientists call it the Permian Triassic extinction event. But among themselves, they use a different name. The Great Dying. Because that's what it was. The greatest dying in the history of life on Earth. Now, you might be thinking, okay, massive volcanoes, obviously that's bad. Lava kills things. Ash blocks out the sun. We've all seen disaster movies, but here's what makes the Permian extinction so terrifying, so absolute in its destruction. The volcanoes were just the beginning. They were the match that lit a fuse connected to a dozen different bombs scattered across the Earth system. Each explosion triggering the next in a cascade of catastrophe that fed on itself for millennia. The volcanoes pumped carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Huge amounts. Enough to raise global temperatures by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. That's 18 to 27 degrees Fahrenheit. Imagine every summer heat wave you've ever experienced. Then add another 20 degrees on top of that. Now imagine that's the new normal forever, or at least for the next 100,000 years. But CO2 wasn't the worst of it. The eruptions also released sulfur dioxide, which combined with water vapour to create sulfuric acid rain. Not metaphorical acid rain, actual acid. Rain that could burn skin, that dissolved limestone, that turned the oceans increasingly acidic. The same oceans where 96% of species were about to die. And then there was the methane, locked in frozen deposits on the ocean floor and in Arctic permafrost, were massive reserves of methane hydrates. Methane is a greenhouse gas about 80 times more potent than CO2 over short timescales. As the planet warmed from the volcanic CO2, it reached a tipping point. The methane deposits began to destabilize. Billions of tons of methane bubbled up from the ocean floor and belched out of thawing permafrost. This triggered more warming, which released more methane, which triggered more warming. A feedback loop, scientists call it. A runaway greenhouse effect. The kind of thing that doesn't stop on its own. The warming oceans couldn't hold as much oxygen. Warmer water, less dissolved gas. That's just chemistry. So oxygen levels in the ocean began to drop. Not everywhere at once, but starting in the deep ocean and spreading upward. Dead zones formed, expanded, merged. Vast regions of ocean where nothing could breathe. On land, the heat and drought devastated forests. When forests die, they stop absorbing CO2. Some of them burned, releasing even more carbon into the atmosphere. The ash and soot from burning continents darkened the skies, but not enough to cool things down, not enough to stop what was coming. And through all of this, over tens of thousands of years, life just kept dying. Species that had dominated Earth for millions of years simply ran out of options. The trilobites, those armoured arthropods that had crawled across ocean floors for 270 million years, surviving multiple previous extinction events, finally went extinct. Every single species. The synapsids, the dominant land animals, sometimes called mammal-like reptiles, were nearly wiped out. Only a handful of species survived. The coral reefs, which had taken millions of years to build, dissolved in the acidifying oceans. The forests fell silent as insects died. The skies emptied as flying creatures suffocated in the thin, hot air. If you'd been there, standing on a beach 252 million years ago, watching the sun rise over a dying ocean, you would have seen a world transformed into something alien. The water thick with algae, but not the productive kind. Toxic blooms fed by nutrients washing off the barren continents. The air shimmering with heat, difficult to breathe, stinking of sulphur. The silence would have been the worst part. No birds, because birds didn't exist yet. No insect buzzing. No waves of life moving through the shallows. Just the lapping of poisoned water against empty shores. This is the story of that catastrophe. How it started, how it spread, how it killed, and most remarkably how life somehow clawed its way back from the edge of total extinction. It's a story written in rocks and fossils, decoded by scientists over decades of painstaking research. A story that took place so long ago that entire mountain ranges have risen and eroded away since then. But it's also a story that matters right now, today, as you lie there breathing easily in the dark. Because the mechanisms that nearly killed Earth 252 million years ago, volcanic CO2, warming oceans, feedback loops, they're not gone. They're not ancient history locked safely in the past. They're just sleeping. And we should probably understand what woke them up last time. 252 million years ago, Earth looked like nothing you've ever seen. Not because it was alien or barren or hostile, but because it was so impossibly full of life that the entire planet seemed to be breathing as one living organism. The continents weren't scattered across the globe like they are today. They were crushed together into a single massive landmass that geologists call Pangaea. All the land in the world jammed into one supercontinent that stretched from pole to pole. And this created a planet of extremes. Imagine standing at the centre of Pangaea, somewhere in what would eventually become Central Asia. You're thousands of miles from the nearest ocean in any direction. The interior of the supercontinent was the largest desert the world had ever known. Temperatures that could swing 50 degrees between day and night. Months without a single drop of rain. Winds that screamed across empty plains with nothing to slow them down. It was brutal, unforgiving, and almost completely lifeless for much of the year. But then the monsoons would come, seasonal rains driven by temperature differences between the massive continental interior and the surrounding ocean. When the monsoons arrived, the desert transformed overnight. Temporary lakes appeared, filled with fish and amphibians that had somehow survived the dry season buried in mud. Plants exploded from dormant seeds. The whole landscape turned green for a few precious months before the water evaporated again and the cycle repeated. This was Pangaea's heartland, extreme, seasonal and harsh. But around the edges, along the coasts, it was paradise. The coastal zones of the late Permian were some of the most productive ecosystems in Earth's history. Warm, shallow seas full of nutrients, river deltas carrying sediment and organic matter from the continental interior, forests so dense they created their own weather systems, and everywhere, life. More species, more biomass, more ecological complexity than the planet had ever supported before. The forests weren't like modern forests. There were no flowering plants yet. No grasses, no roses, no oak trees. Instead, the lowland forests were dominated by seed ferns. These weren't true ferns, despite the name. They were an entirely separate group of plants that had evolved to reproduce using seeds rather than spores. Massive trees with frond-like leaves that could reach 100 feet tall, creating dense canopies that blocked out most of the sunlight below. Between the seed ferns grew stands of conifers, early relatives of modern pines and spruces, but adapted to the hot, humid climate of the Permian coast. And everywhere, in the understory and along the forest edges, grew ginkgos. The same basic tree design that still exists today, a living fossil that would watch the rise and fall of countless other species over the next 250 million years. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves, decaying wood, and the bodies of countless small animals. This detritus supported an entire ecosystem of decomposers, primitive beetles that had evolved to break down tough plant material, centipedes and millipedes, some as long as your forearm, early cockroaches that scuttled through the leaf litter, and fungi, mushrooms, moulds, and microscopic decomposers that turned dead matter back into nutrients that the trees could use. But the most impressive residents of these forests weren't the plants, they were the animals. Walking through a late Permian forest, you would have encountered creatures that seemed to belong to a fever dream rather than actual evolutionary history. Take the Dinocephalians, massive herbivorous therapsids, proto-mammals that had diverged from the reptilian line tens of millions of years earlier. Some species stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder and weighed over a ton. They had massive barrel chests, thick legs like tree trunks, and heads that seemed grotesquely oversized for their bodies. These were the mega herbivores of their time, moving slowly through the forest understory, stripping bark from trees, pulling down branches to reach young leaves. Their teeth were designed for processing tough plant material, rows of grinding molars that could break down even the most fibrous vegetation. And they needed them, because they had to eat constantly to fuel their enormous bodies. But the Dinocephalians weren't the strangest things in these forests. That honour belonged to the Dimetrodons and their relatives. Picture a reptile the size of a large dog, but with a sail on its back. Not a fin for swimming, a sail. A thin membrane of skin stretched between elongated spinal vertebrae that could stand 2 feet tall. It looked like someone had strapped a surfboard to a lizard. Scientists think these sails were thermoregulatory devices, living solar panels that could absorb heat in the morning to warm up quickly, or dissipate heat in the afternoon to prevent overheating. This gave sail-backed animals a crucial advantage in the Permian world of temperature extremes. They could be active earlier in the day than their competitors, giving them extra hours to hunt or forage, and hunt they did. Despite their bizarre appearance, Dimetrodons and their relatives were apex predators. They had massive skulls with differentiated teeth, not just rows of identical fangs like most reptiles, but specialised teeth for different functions. Cutting teeth at the front, piercing canines on the sides, and shearing teeth in the back. This was an early version of the mammalian dental pattern, and it made them incredibly effective hunters. They stalked the forest edges, hunting the herbivorous therapsids and the abundant small vertebrates that scurried through the undergrowth. Their hunting strategy was probably similar to modern crocodiles. Slow, patient stalking followed by a sudden explosive attack. Once those jaws closed on prey, the differentiated teeth made escape almost impossible. But by the late Permian, the age of the sailbacks was ending. They were being replaced by something even more remarkable. True therapsids, the direct ancestors of mammals. These weren't primitive reptiles with a few mammal-like features. They were nearly mammals in all but name. The most successful group were the Gorgonopsians, predators that range from the size of a large dog to animals that rivaled modern lions. They had abandoned the sailback body plan entirely. Instead, they had developed different adaptations for temperature regulation. Some scientists think they may have had primitive hair, not the sophisticated fur of modern mammals, but simple filaments that could provide insulation and help maintain stable body temperatures. Their skeletons show increasingly mammalian features, legs that were positioned more directly under the body rather than sprawling out to the sides like reptile legs. This allowed for more efficient movement. They could run faster and for longer periods than their ancestors. Some species could probably sustain a trotting pace for hours, something no modern reptile can do. Their skulls were even more impressive. Massive temporal openings behind the eyes that allowed room for powerful jaw muscles, teeth that were precisely differentiated for killing and eating, and most remarkably, evidence of whiskers. Tiny pits in the snout bones where nerve endings would have supplied blood to sensory whiskers. This suggests they were active hunters even in low-light conditions, using tactile senses to track prey. The Gorgonopsians were the top predators of the late Permian. They hunted in the forests, along rivers, even in the marginal desert zones where seasonal rains brought temporary abundance, and they were incredibly successful. Fossil sites from this period show Gorgonopsian remains everywhere. They are diversified into dozens of species, each adapted to slightly different ecological niches. But they weren't alone at the top of the food chain. Sharing the forest with them were early reptiles that would eventually give rise to a very different lineage. Archosaurs, the ancestors of dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and modern crocodiles. In the Permian, archosaurs were still small and relatively unspecialised. Most were no bigger than house cats. They scurried through the undergrowth, hunting insects and small vertebrates, but they had already developed some of the features that would make their descendants so successful. More efficient breathing systems, better temperature regulation, and increasingly sophisticated locomotion. Some early archosaurs had begun experimenting with bipedal movement, walking on their hind legs rather than on all fours. This was revolutionary. It freed up the forelimbs for other functions and allowed for faster running speeds. These early experiments in bipedalism would eventually lead to the theropod dinosaurs and ultimately to birds. But in the Permian, bipedal archosaurs were just one ecological strategy among many. The really successful archosaurs of this period were still quadrupedal, animals like the Proterosuchids, predators that looked remarkably similar to modern crocodiles. Long bodies, sprawling limbs, and powerful jaws filled with conical teeth. They dominated the riverine environments, hunting fish and ambushing animals that came to drink, and the rivers teemed with prey. The late Permian had some of the most diverse freshwater ecosystems in Earth's history. fish of every size and shape. Some had developed armour plating, scales so thick they were almost like shells. Others had evolved electrical organs for navigation and hunting in murky water. The ancestors of modern ray-finned fish were beginning their evolutionary radiation, experimenting with different body plans and feeding strategies. But the most impressive aquatic predators weren't fish. They were amphibians, giant temnospondyls that could reach 15 feet in length. These weren't the small, salamander-like creatures that most people imagine when they think of amphibians. They were crocodile-sized predators with massive flattened skulls and jaws that could snap shut with incredible force. Temnospondyls lived in rivers, lakes, and coastal swamps. They hunted fish, small reptiles, and even young dinocephalians that ventured too close to the water's edge. Some species never left the water at all. They had evolved into fully aquatic predators. Others could move on land when necessary, hauling their massive bodies out of the water during droughts to find new pools and rivers. The coast itself was where the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems met in a spectacular zone of productivity. Mangrove-like forests that grew directly in the tidal zones. Mudflats, teeming with burrows and tracks. River mouths where nutrients from inland washed into the shallow seas. And beyond the coast, the oceans were more alive than they had ever been before. The Permian seas were built on reefs. Not coral reefs, exactly. Most of the reef building was done by organisms that don't exist anymore. Rugose corals, tabulate corals, and strange reef-building algae that could secrete calcium carbonate to create massive rock-like structures. These reefs stretched for hundreds of miles in the shallow tropical seas. They were barriers, habitats and breeding grounds for countless marine species. Swimming through these reefs were fish unlike anything alive today. Placoderms were gone, extinct for millions of years by this point, but their descendants had diversified into every imaginable ecological role. Cartilaginous fish related to modern sharks but with bizarre body plans. Some had crushing teeth arranged in whorls designed for eating shellfish. Others had elongated saw-like snouts for probing in sediment. The bony fish were even more diverse. Early ray fins with bodies that glittered with metallic scales. Lobe-finned fish that used their muscular fins to prowl along the bottom. And everywhere, smaller fish that formed massive schools, clouds of silver bodies that moved as one, trying to confuse predators. But the most iconic creatures of the Permian seas weren't fish at all. They were arthropods, the trilobites. By the late Permian, trilobites had been around for almost 300 million years. They had survived the Cambrian, the Ordovician, the Silurian, the Devonian, and the Carboniferous. They had weathered multiple mass extinctions and environmental crises. They were the survivors of survivors, a success story written in their fossils across every continent. But they were declining. The Permian trilobites were less diverse than their ancestors had been. Climate changes and competition from other arthropods had reduced them to a fraction of their former glory. By the late Permian, only a few families remained, specialized species living in specific environments that other creatures couldn't exploit as effectively. Still, where they existed, they were abundant. Some species burrowed in muddy bottoms, leaving intricate trail patterns as they searched for food. Others lived among the reefs, using their segmented bodies to squeeze into crevices where predators couldn't follow. A few had become planktonic, floating in the open ocean and filter feeding on microscopic organisms. They had no idea they were living in the twilight of their dynasty. Sharing the reefs and open waters with them were creatures that seem impossibly strange to modern eyes. Sea scorpions, eurypterids. These weren't true scorpions, though they were related. They were aquatic arthropods that had evolved into some of the most efficient predators the oceans had ever seen. Most Permian eurypterids were smaller than their ancestors. The giant forms that had terrorized the Silurian seas were gone, but what remained were highly specialised hunters. Some species had paddle-like limbs for swimming, others had grasping claws for catching fish. All of them had compound eyes that could track fast-moving prey in 3 dimensions. The ocean floor itself was a landscape of life. Sea lilies, crinoids that looked like flowers but were actually animals, their feathery arms waving in the current to catch passing food particles. Brachiopods that looked superficially like clams but were completely unrelated, filtering water through their shells. And ammonoids, cephalopods related to modern nautiluses, with coiled shells that could reach several feet in diameter. The ammonoids were the cephalopod's answer to fish. Fast, intelligent hunters that used jet propulsion to chase down prey. They had excellent vision, grasping tentacles, and the ability to change colour for camouflage. In many ways, they filled the same ecological roles that squid and octopuses fill today, but they carried their homes with them, spiral shells divided into chambers that they could fill with gas to control their buoyancy. All of this, the forests, the rivers, the reefs, the open ocean, all of it was functioning as an integrated system, a planetary ecosystem more complex than anything that had existed before. But it wasn't stable, not entirely. Even before the catastrophe, there were signs that the Permian world was under stress. The climate had been warming gradually for millions of years, not catastrophically, but persistently. The inland deserts were expanding. The monsoons were becoming more erratic. Some regions that had been forested for tens of millions of years were beginning to dry out. The ocean chemistry was starting to shift too. Scientists analysing Permian rocks have found evidence of gradually declining oxygen levels in some marine environments, not everywhere and not severely, but enough to suggest that something fundamental was changing about how the ocean circulated and mixed. Continental weathering patterns were also changing. The massive Hercynian mountains, created by the collision of continents that formed Pangaea, were eroding. This sent huge amounts of sediment and nutrients into the oceans. In the short term, this was good for marine life. More nutrients meant more productivity, but it also meant more organic matter sinking to the ocean floor, where its decomposition could consume dissolved oxygen. The forests themselves were beginning to show stress in some regions. Fossil charcoal deposits from the late Permian show evidence of increasing wildfires. As the climate warmed and dried, fire became more frequent. Some forest ecosystems were adapted to this. Many seed ferns and conifers had thick bark that could survive occasional burning, but the frequency was increasing beyond what the plants could handle. Animal populations were showing stress patterns too. Some fossil sites from the last few million years of the Permian show declining diversity. Not mass extinctions, just a gradual thinning of the number of species. Some of the specialised forms were disappearing first. Animals that had adapted to very specific environmental conditions were finding that those conditions were becoming less predictable. The Gorgonopsians were still dominant, but they were beginning to face competition from an unexpected source. Some therapsid lineages had evolved in a different direction. Instead of becoming bigger predators, they had become smaller omnivores and insectivores. These were the cynodonts, the direct ancestors of true mammals. They were tiny in the Permian, most no bigger than rats, but they were highly adaptable, with more efficient metabolism and more sophisticated parental care than any previous animals. When environmental conditions were stable, the big predators dominated. But as conditions became more variable, adaptability started to matter more than size and strength. The cynodonts were positioned perfectly for a changing world. They just didn't know that the change was about to accelerate beyond anything evolution had prepared them for. In the oceans, similar patterns were emerging. The reef systems were still spectacular, but growth rates had slowed slightly. Some reef-building species were declining in abundance. The shallow seas that had supported the reefs were changing. becoming warmer and slightly more acidic as atmospheric carbon dioxide levels crept upward. This wasn't obvious to any hypothetical observer. The reef still looked healthy. The forests still teemed with life. The predators still hunted, the prey still fled, and the cycle of life and death continued as it had for millions of years. But the stresses were accumulating, like a building with slowly weakening foundations. Everything looked fine on the surface, but the underlying structure was becoming increasingly vulnerable to any major shock. And the shock was coming. Deep beneath what would become Siberia, magma was accumulating in vast chambers. Pressure was building. The planetary systems that had kept Earth stable for tens of millions of years were about to fail catastrophically. The creatures of the late Permian had no way to know this. The Gorgonopsians prowling through the forests, the Dinocephalians browsing on seed ferns, the trilobites crawling along reef faces, the ammonoids hunting in the open ocean. None of them could sense the catastrophe building beneath their world. They were living in the last moments of one of the most successful eras in Earth's history. An age when life had conquered every environment from pole to pole, when ecosystems had reached unprecedented complexity, when the planet seemed more alive than it had ever been. They were living in paradise, and they had no idea it was about to end. It started in what is now central Siberia. 252 million years ago, the ground began to shake. Not the sharp, violent shaking of an earthquake. This was different. A deep, sustained trembling that went on for days, then weeks. Animals that had weathered countless tremors before sensed something was wrong. They fled from the region, but there was nowhere to run that would matter. Deep beneath the surface, something catastrophic was happening. A massive plume of superheated rock, hundreds of kilometers across, was rising from the boundary between Earth's mantle and core. This wasn't a normal magma pocket. This was a planetary-scale thermal anomaly, a column of molten rock ascending through over 2,900 kilometers of Earth's interior, carrying enough heat to liquefy the continental crust above it. When it reached the surface, the planet split open. But this wasn't a volcano erupting in the way we typically imagine, no single mountain exploding in a dramatic blast. What happened in Siberia was something far more apocalyptic. The crust fractured along massive fissures, some of them hundreds of kilometers long, and from these cracks, lava began to pour out. Not lava fountains shooting into the sky, not pyroclastic explosions launching rock and ash, just lava flowing out of the ground like blood from a wound. Rivers of molten rock, each one kilometers wide, spread it across the landscape at walking speed. Unstoppable, inexorable, consuming everything in their path. Geologists call this flood basalt volcanism, and it operates on a scale that makes ordinary volcanic eruptions look like firecrackers. A typical volcanic eruption, even a catastrophic one like Mount St. Helens or Krakatoa, releases maybe a few cubic kilometers of material over hours or days. The Siberian Traps would release over 4 million cubic kilometers of lava over the next several 100,000 years. Think about that scale for a moment. 4 million cubic kilometers. That's enough lava to bury the entire continental United States under a layer 400 meters deep. Enough to create a flow that could cover an area the size of Europe. And it wasn't released all at once. It came in pulses, wave after wave of molten rock, each pulse lasting thousands of years, with brief respites in between that might have offered false hope before the next eruption cycle began. The initial flows spread across the Siberian landscape like water from a broken dam. The lava was basaltic, relatively fluid compared to the thick explosive magma that creates stratovolcanoes. This fluidity was both a curse and a blessing. It didn't explode violently, so it didn't immediately inject massive amounts of ash into the stratosphere. but it could travel. Those first flows raced across hundreds of kilometres, filling valleys, burying forests, creating vast plains of cooling rock that glowed red for months before finally solidifying into black basalt. As the lava advanced, it incinerated everything organic. Trees that had stood for centuries burst into flames before the flows even reached them, ignited by the radiant heat. Animals that couldn't flee fast, enough were overtaken and entombed in stone. Entire ecosystems vanished beneath meters of cooling rock in the span of days. But the immediate destruction, as catastrophic as it was, wasn't the real killer. That came from what happened underground. The magma rising through the Siberian crust wasn't moving through solid rock. Siberia in the Permian was underlain by massive deposits of coal, salt and limestone. Sedimentary rocks formed from ancient seas and forests, now buried kilometres deep. The ascending magma punched right through these deposits, heating them to thousands of degrees. When magma intrudes through coal, something terrifying happens. Coal is essentially concentrated carbon. Heat it enough, and it doesn't just burn. It vaporizes, releasing enormous volumes of carbon dioxide and, more importantly, methane. The Siberian coal deposits were vast. Hundreds of gigatons of organic carbon accumulated over millions of years of carboniferous forest growth. The magma intrusions effectively turned these ancient coal seams into the world's largest gas factory. Methane began venting from fissures across the region, not the controlled seeps you might see in natural gas fields today. These were massive blowouts, eruptions of greenhouse gas on a scale that has never been repeated in Earth's history. Methane is about 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas over short timescales, and the Siberian Traps were pumping it into the atmosphere by the teraton. The salt deposits created a different problem. When magma heats halite, sodium chloride, it breaks down into sodium and chlorine compounds. The chlorine gets released as various gases, including hydrogen chloride and organochlorines, formed from interaction with organic material. These chlorine compounds rose into the atmosphere, where they would prove catastrophically effective at destroying ozone. The limestone added its own contribution. Calcium carbonate, heated by magma, decomposes into calcium oxide and carbon dioxide. More greenhouse gas released not just from the lava itself, but from the vast volumes of sedimentary rock being cooked by the intrusions. Every cubic kilometre of magma that pushed through limestone released additional megatons of CO2. The atmospheric injection was happening on multiple fronts. The lava flows themselves were releasing volcanic gases. Sulfur dioxide poured out in quantities measured in gigatons. This SO2 would have immediate effects, combining with water vapour to create sulfuric acid aerosols that would reflect sunlight and cause short-term cooling. But volcanic winter was the least of Earth's problems. Carbon dioxide came next. Every volcanic system releases CO2, but the Siberian Traps were operating on unprecedented scales. The lava itself was outgassing. The intrusions through carbonate rocks were producing it thermally, and the heating of organic deposits was adding even more. Within the first few thousand years of eruptions, atmospheric CO2 concentrations began climbing from roughly 400 parts per million, similar to modern pre-industrial levels, toward levels that would eventually exceed 2000 ppm. But the methane was the real accelerant. CH4 released from the heated coal beds began accumulating in the atmosphere. Unlike CO2, which plants and weathering processes can eventually scrub out, methane builds up quickly and creates rapid warming, and rapid warming triggers feedback loops. The eruptions came in pulses, not a continuous outpouring, but distinct episodes of activity separated by centuries or millennia. Each pulse would last for thousands of years. New fissures would open, new flows would spread across already devastated landscapes. The volcanic system was like a pressure relief valve that couldn't fully close. Between pulses, life might have attempted recovery. Plants might have started colonizing the margins of the lava fields. Animals might have moved back into regions where the flows had cooled and weathered enough to support vegetation. Then the next pulse would begin, and the devastation would renew. The scale of the lava accumulation is hard to visualize. Geologists studying the Siberian Traps today find basalt layers stacked hundreds of meters thick in some locations, individual flows that extend for hundreds of kilometers. The total volume of lava eventually covered an area of roughly 2 million square kilometers, an expanse larger than Alaska, beneath flows that averaged over a kilometer in depth. In some spots, the accumulation reached 3 kilometers of stacked basalt layers. This wasn't just surface volcanism. The magma intrusions underground were creating vast sill complexes, horizontal sheets of intrusive rock, hundreds of meters thick, spreading through the sedimentary layers like giant underground lakes of molten stone. These sills were still heating the surrounding rocks, still generating gases, still contributing to atmospheric loading long after the surface flows had stopped. The immediate regional effects were apocalyptic. Ashfall spread across much of northern Pangaea. Not the stratospheric ash that causes volcanic winters that would come from different mechanisms later, but local ash that buried landscapes under meters of grey powder. The ash was toxic, high in fluorine and other elements that poison vegetation and water supplies. Rivers were blocked by lava flows, creating massive temporary lakes that would eventually breach their dams in catastrophic floods. These flood events scoured the landscape, carrying volcanic debris thousands of kilometers from the source, spreading the contamination across Pangaea's interior. The region that had once been part of Pangaea's northern forests became a hellscape. Smoking lava fields stretched to every horizon, the air thick with volcanic gases that killed anything that tried to breathe it. Temperatures near the active flows hot enough to ignite spontaneous fires in any remaining vegetation. The sky dark with ash and sulfur compounds that blocked the sun and created perpetual twilight. But the real catastrophe wasn't what was happening in Siberia. It was what was beginning to happen everywhere else. The gases pouring into the atmosphere didn't stay local. Prevailing winds began distributing them across the entire planet. The sulfur dioxide formed aerosol layers in the stratosphere, creating a thin veil that reflected incoming sunlight. In the first decades after the eruptions began, global temperatures actually dropped. Volcanic winter descended on a planet that couldn't afford any additional climate stress. Plants that had been thriving in the warm Permian climate found themselves struggling with sudden cold snaps and reduced sunlight. Photosynthesis became less efficient. Growth rates slowed. Some species, particularly those already living at the edges of their tolerance ranges, began dying off. But this cooling was temporary and in a way merciful compared to what was coming. Sulfur aerosols only remain in the atmosphere for a few years. They fall out as acid rain, they get washed away, they settle onto the surface. The cooling effect doesn't last, but the carbon dioxide and methane accumulating alongside the sulfur, those persist. CO2 remains in the atmosphere for centuries. Methane lasts for decades before oxidizing, and when it oxidizes, it becomes more CO2. So the short-term pattern was brutal. Cold snaps that killed tropical species, followed by rapid warming as the greenhouse gases overwhelmed the cooling effect of the aerosols. Then another eruption pulse would inject new sulfur, creating another cold snap. The climate wasn't just warming, it was oscillating wildly, swinging between extremes on timescales too rapid for evolution to adapt to. The volcanic system was also releasing halogens, chlorine and fluorine compounds that rose into the stratosphere and began attacking the ozone layer. Ozone depletion had never happened on Earth before. There had never been a natural mechanism to produce it at these scales. but the Siberian Traps were creating one. As stratospheric ozone concentrations dropped, ultraviolet radiation at the surface began increasing. UVB radiation, the type most damaging to DNA and organic molecules, started penetrating to ground level in quantities that life had never evolved defences against. Plants growing in full sunlight were being bombarded with mutagenic radiation. Animals with exposed skin developed burns and cancers. The most vulnerable were aquatic organisms living in shallow, clear waters where UV penetration is deepest. But the cascade was just beginning. Each effect triggered additional effects. The warming from greenhouse gases began affecting ocean circulation. The UV radiation was damaging phytoplankton, the foundation of marine food webs. The acid rain from sulfur compounds was altering soil chemistry across Pangaea. And there was one more mechanism at play, one that wouldn't become apparent for tens of thousands of years, but that would prove to be the final nail in the coffin for most Permian life. The warming was approaching a critical threshold. Ocean surface temperatures were climbing, and in the deep ocean, in the sediments of the continental shelves and abyssal plains, there were vast deposits of a strange substance called methane clathrate, or methane hydrate. This is methane trapped in a cage of ice molecules, stable only at low temperatures and high pressures. It accumulates in ocean sediments over millions of years as bacteria break down organic matter and produce methane that gets locked into these frozen structures. Earth's oceans contain trillions of tons of methane locked in clathrates, and as the oceans warmed from the volcanic greenhouse gases, these deposits were approaching their stability limit. Once ocean temperatures rose past a certain threshold, the clathrates would begin to destabilize, the ice cages would melt, and all that trapped methane would be released into the water column, where it would bubble up to the surface and enter the atmosphere. This is called a clathrate gun. It's a feedback mechanism. Warming releases methane, methane causes more warming releases more methane. Once triggered, it becomes self-sustaining until the deposits are exhausted. The Siberian Traps were loading the gun. Every gigaton of CO2 and methane from the volcanic system was pushing ocean temperatures higher, getting closer to the trigger point, and once that threshold was crossed, the volcanism itself would become almost irrelevant. The planet would take over the job of killing itself, but we're not there yet. For now, maybe 10,000 or 20,000 years into the eruptions, the world was still just dealing with the direct volcanic effects. Deadly, yes. Catastrophic, absolutely. But survivable for most species if it had stopped there. It wouldn't stop there. The Siberian Traps would continue erupting for hundreds of thousands of years. The greenhouse gases would continue accumulating. The climate would continue destabilizing. And eventually the oceans themselves would turn against life. The eruptions spreading across Siberia were just the match being struck. The real fire was about to engulf an entire world. The Siberian Traps had opened Earth's crust like a wound. Lava was still pouring out month after month, year after year, but the real killing had barely begun. Because what happened next wasn't just volcanic eruptions, it was a cascade, a chain reaction of environmental catastrophes where each disaster triggered the next, each failure in Earth's systems amplifying all the others until the entire planet was caught in a death spiral that would last for hundreds of thousands of years. The first thing that changed was the temperature, and it changed fast. Within just a few thousand years, global average temperatures rose by 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. That might not sound like much. Your room temperature probably varies more than that over the course of a day, but we're talking about the average temperature of the entire planet, oceans and continents, poles and equator, all rising together. Some regions, particularly the high latitudes near the poles, warmed even faster. 15 degrees Celsius in some areas, maybe more. To put that in perspective, the difference between the Ice Age and today is only about 5 degrees Celsius of global average warming. The Permian extinction saw double that, happening 50 times faster. This wasn't gradual climate change that species could adapt to over millennia. This was geological violence playing out on timescales that evolution simply couldn't match. Animals that had spent millions of years adapting to specific temperature ranges suddenly found themselves cooking alive in environments that had become lethally hot. Plants calibrated to precise seasonal patterns watched their entire life cycles disrupted as temperatures that should signal winter never arrived. The Arctic and Antarctic regions, which had been cool but habitable, transformed into steaming subtropical zones. Glaciers that had persisted for millions of years melted in what amounted to geological seconds. The ice that had reflected solar radiation back into space disappeared, replaced by dark ocean water and land that absorbed heat, driving temperatures even higher. But the warming itself was just the beginning. As carbon dioxide continued pouring into the atmosphere, trillions of tons of it over hundreds of thousands of years, something else started happening. The gas began dissolving into the oceans. This is a normal process. Oceans naturally absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. It's part of Earth's carbon cycle, one of the mechanisms that usually keeps the climate stable over long time periods. But the Siberian Traps were producing CO2 far beyond anything Earth's natural systems could handle. When carbon dioxide dissolves in water, it forms carbonic acid. Just a weak acid, the same thing that gives soda its slight tang. But the ocean waters of the late Permian weren't just getting a slight tang. They were becoming measurably acidic, their pH dropping from the slightly alkaline conditions that had prevailed for millions of years. This was catastrophic for anything that built its body out of calcium carbonate, anything with a shell. Corals, clams, snails, microscopic plankton with delicate calcium shells, creatures that had flourished in Permian seas for hundreds of millions of years, all of them suddenly found their shells dissolving. Not metaphorically, literally dissolving in water that had become too acidic to support calcium carbonate structures. Imagine being a coral trying to build your skeleton while the very water you live in is actively eating away at everything you construct. Imagine being a baby plankton, just formed your first delicate shell, and the ocean around you starts dissolving it faster than you can repair it. The reefs collapsed first. These weren't just habitat for corals, they were entire ecosystems, three-dimensional structures that provided shelter and feeding grounds for thousands of other species. When the reef-building organisms died, everything that depended on them died too. Fish, crustaceans, worms, algae, all the intricate food webs that had evolved around reef structures over millions of years, gone within a few thousand years. But the reef collapse was just the visible part of a much deeper crisis. The real killing was happening in the water itself, at the molecular level where oxygen was disappearing. Under normal conditions, Earth's oceans are full of oxygen. Surface waters absorb it from the atmosphere. Ocean currents, driven by temperature and salinity differences, circulate that oxygen throughout the water column, carrying it down to the deep sea where it supports life even thousands of meters below the surface. But the Permian warming destroyed this circulation system. Here's what happened. Ocean circulation depends on density differences. Cold, salty water is dense. It sinks. Warm, fresh water is less dense. It floats. This difference creates currents, conveyor belts that move water and oxygen around the planet. In the Atlantic today, cold water forms near Greenland, sinks, and flows south along the ocean floor, eventually upwelling near Antarctica, bringing deep nutrients to the surface. This thermohaline circulation, as scientists call it, is literally the engine that drives ocean mixing. The Permian warming broke that engine. As temperatures rose, the density difference between surface and deep water decreased. Cold, sinking water wasn't as cold anymore. The currents slowed. Then, in many regions, they stopped entirely. The oceans stratified, separating into distinct layers that no longer mixed. Surface water stayed at the surface, getting warmer and warmer. Deep water stayed at the bottom, cut off from atmospheric oxygen, slowly consuming what oxygen remained through bacterial respiration and organic decay. The deep oceans began dying first. Without oxygen replenishment, the bottom waters of Permian seas became anoxic, completely depleted of dissolved oxygen. Bottom-dwelling creatures, the trilobites and brachiopods and ancient crinoids that had carpeted the seafloor for hundreds of millions of years, suffocated. Their bodies piled up, creating thick layers of organic-rich sediment that paleontologists can still find today, 252 million years later. Black shales, they're called, the signature of dead, oxygen-free oceans. But anoxia didn't stay in the deep water. As circulation continued to fail, the boundary between oxygenated surface water and anoxic deep water began rising. Imagine it like a tide, except instead of water rising, it's the absence of oxygen creeping upward through the water column, slowly, inexorably, killing everything as it rose. The oxygen minimum zone, the layer between oxygenated and anoxic water, expanded from a few hundred meters thick to thousands of meters. Eventually, in many areas, it reached the surface. Shallow coastal seas, which should have been the most oxygen-rich, most life-supporting environments in the ocean, became dead zones where nothing could breathe. And that's when things got truly nightmarish. Because in oxygen-free water, different kinds of bacteria take over. Not the normal bacteria that respire oxygen like most life does. Anaerobic bacteria, ancient organisms that evolved billions of years ago before oxygen became common in Earth's atmosphere. These bacteria use sulfate instead of oxygen for metabolism, and their waste product isn't the relatively harmless carbon dioxide that oxygen-breathing organisms produce. Their waste product is hydrogen sulfide, H2S, the same chemical that gives rotten eggs their smell. In tiny amounts, hydrogen sulfide is just unpleasant. In large amounts, it's one of the most toxic substances on Earth. It binds to the same cellular machinery that normally processes oxygen, shutting down respiration at the molecular level. Breathing air with even 1% hydrogen sulfide will kill you within minutes. Your cells literally can't process oxygen anymore, even if it's available. In the anoxic depths of Permian oceans, sulfate-reducing bacteria multiplied wildly, feeding on the rain of dead organic matter falling from the dying surface waters. They produced hydrogen sulfide on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Not parts per million, not parts per thousand. Some ocean water during the peak extinction was probably several percent hydrogen sulfide by volume. That water was essentially poison, and it was rising. The hydrogen sulfide-rich deep water, slightly denser than the surface water but mixing at the boundaries, began spreading upward and outward. Wherever it went, it killed. Fish that had survived the warming and the acidification and the oxygen loss suddenly found themselves swimming in toxic water that burned their gills and shut down their metabolism. The few remaining bottom dwellers that had retreated to shallower water trying to find oxygen found themselves fleeing a toxic flood that followed them up the continental shelves. But the hydrogen sulfide didn't stop at the ocean's surface. At the interface between water and air, H2S gas began bubbling out of solution, fizzing up like poison champagne, entering the atmosphere. Hydrogen sulfide is heavier than air. It tends to hug the ground, spreading across low-lying areas, accumulating in valleys and coastal plains. Terrestrial animals living near the oceans suddenly found themselves breathing toxic fumes. Not constantly, not everywhere, but in pulses, when wind patterns carried the gas inland, or when particularly high concentrations bubbled up from offshore dead zones, animals that had survived the heat and the drought suddenly faced a new threat, invisible, odourless at high enough concentrations where it overwhelms the olfactory system, and absolutely lethal. But the hydrogen sulfide caused another problem too, one that would affect life even far from the poison coasts. When H2S reaches the upper atmosphere, it reacts with oxygen. It doesn't just react, it destroys ozone. Stratospheric ozone, O3, the molecule that forms a protective layer in the upper atmosphere, shielding Earth's surface from the sun's ultraviolet radiation. The ozone layer is one of those things we don't think about until it's gone. It's invisible, intangible, just a slightly higher concentration of a particular form of oxygen floating 20 to 30 kilometres above our heads. But it's absolutely critical for life. UVB and UVC radiation from the sun, the high energy wavelengths that the ozone layer normally absorbs, are incredibly destructive to biological molecules. They shred DNA, they break down proteins, they kill cells. Life on Earth had only colonised land after the ozone layer formed, hundreds of millions of years earlier. Before that, UV radiation made the surface essentially uninhabitable. Anything exposed to direct sunlight would have been sterilised by radiation. During the Permian extinction, that protection began to fail. As hydrogen sulfide rose into the stratosphere, it catalysed the breakdown of ozone molecules, thinning the protective layer. Not eliminating it entirely, but reducing it enough that UV radiation at the surface increased dramatically. Some estimates suggest UV intensity may have doubled or even tripled during the worst phases of the extinction. For plants, this was catastrophic. Land plants in the Permian were already stressed by heat and drought. Now they were being irradiated, their cells damaged faster than they could repair the DNA damage. Forest canopies that had persisted for millions of years began dying back. Not from disease, not from herbivores, but from sunburn essentially. Radiation damage accumulating faster than growth could replace it. The fossil record from this period shows a sudden spike in plant spores with thick, protective walls. This is exactly what you'd expect if plants were being exposed to high UV radiation. They're protecting their reproductive cells, wrapping them in extra layers of UV-blocking material, trying to ensure at least some seeds or spores survive even if the parent plants die. But it wasn't just plants suffering from the UV radiation. Phytoplankton, the microscopic algae that form the base of ocean food webs, are particularly vulnerable to UV damage. They live right at the ocean surface where sunlight penetrates, where they need to be to photosynthesize. Under normal conditions, the ozone layer protects them. During the extinction, they were exposed. Studies of modern phytoplankton show that even modest increases in UV radiation can reduce their growth rates by 10 to 20%. During the Permian extinction, with UV levels potentially doubled, phytoplankton populations likely crashed, and when the base of the food web collapses, everything above it collapses too. The oceans were dying from the bottom up, starved of oxygen, and from the top down, poisoned by hydrogen sulfide and cooked by UV radiation. But there was one more feedback loop, one more amplifying disaster waiting to be triggered. Methane. Under normal conditions, vast amounts of methane are trapped in ocean sediments, frozen into structures called methane hydrates or clathrates. These are essentially ice cages that hold methane molecules under pressure in cold, deep ocean water. There's an enormous amount of it, probably more carbon trapped as methane hydrates than exists in all Earth's coal, oil and natural gas deposits combined. Methane hydrates are stable as long as pressure stays high and temperature stays low, but they're sensitive. Raise the temperature a few degrees and they start breaking down, releasing their methane into the water column. That's exactly what happened in the Permian. As ocean temperatures rose from the initial CO2-driven warming, the deep waters warmed too. Slowly at first, but remember, ocean circulation had stopped. Heat was accumulating instead of being dispersed. The seafloor temperature in some regions rose enough to destabilize methane hydrates. They began releasing their stored methane, bubbles of methane gas, rising through anoxic water, reaching the surface, entering the atmosphere. And methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, much more effective at trapping heat than carbon dioxide. Over short timescales, a molecule of methane in the atmosphere causes about 80 times more warming than a molecule of CO2. This created a runaway feedback loop. Warming released methane. Methane caused more warming. More warming released more methane. The process feeding on itself, accelerating, spiraling out of control. Some researchers think methane releases during the Permian extinction may have been catastrophic. Sudden bursts where vast quantities of hydrate broke down essentially at once, sending clouds of methane bubbling to the surface, creating temporary zones where ocean water literally frothed with escaping gas. These methane burps, as they're sometimes called, would have delivered additional pulses of warming on top of the already catastrophic temperature rise. Each pulse killing species that had survived the previous disasters, each burst pushing the climate further into territory where life simply couldn't function. The geological evidence for massive methane release is written in rocks from this period. Carbon isotopes in limestone and organic matter show distinctive patterns, sudden shifts in the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13 that can only be explained by huge inputs of methane-derived carbon. It happened multiple times during the extinction. Waves of methane release spread over hundreds of thousands of years, and each wave made everything worse. The warming got worse, the ocean anoxia got worse, the hydrogen sulfide production got worse, the ozone destruction got worse, every system failure amplifying every other system failure, creating a web of cascading disasters where there was no safe refuge, no escape, no environment on Earth that wasn't being transformed into something hostile to life. Terrestrial animals faced impossible choices. Stay near the coasts where water and vegetation were still available, but risk exposure to hydrogen sulfide gas and poisoned water, or retreat inland where temperatures were even higher, where drought had turned forests into deserts, where food was scarce and UV radiation was lethal. Marine animals had no choices at all. They lived in water, and the water was dying. The oxygen that complex life requires was disappearing from the oceans, not gradually, not in isolated regions that animals could swim away from, globally. The anoxic zones were spreading. The dead zones were growing. The places where a fish could breathe, where a trilobite could survive, where plankton could grow, those places were shrinking. Life was being squeezed into smaller and smaller refugia, isolated pockets of marginally habitable conditions, while the rest of the planet burned and suffocated and poisoned itself. And the worst part? This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a brief catastrophe followed by recovery. The Siberian Traps erupted for somewhere between 1 and 2 million years. The cascade of environmental failures they triggered persisted for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe longer. Generation after generation after generation of animals were born into a dying world, struggled to survive impossible conditions, and died without seeing any improvement. There was no cavalry coming to save the Permian biosphere, no sudden return to normal conditions, just centuries upon centuries of deterioration, where each generation faced conditions slightly worse than their parents', where adaptation was impossible because the environment was changing faster than evolution could respond. This was the cascade of death, not one thing killing everything, but everything killing everything else. All the systems that normally support life failing simultaneously, creating combinations of environmental stresses that no organism had ever encountered before, that nothing was adapted to handle. And 96% of species couldn't handle it. They went extinct. Just gone. Wiped out by heat or acid or anoxia or poison or radiation or starvation or some combination of all of them at once. The ones that survived weren't the strongest or the smartest or the most common. They were the lucky ones, the species that happened to have just the right combination of traits to tolerate just enough of just the right stresses to make it through. They were the accidents, the improbable survivors of the most hostile conditions Earth had experienced in hundreds of millions of years. The oceans had become a stratified, oxygen-depleted, toxic nightmare. The atmosphere was choked with greenhouse gases, poisonous fumes, and unfiltered radiation. The land was too hot, too dry, too irradiated to support the forest ecosystems that had covered continents for millions of years. Earth in the late Permian wasn't just suffering an extinction, it was undergoing a transformation, a conversion from a life-supporting planet to something that resembled a slow-motion apocalypse. A world where the normal rules of habitability had been suspended, where the systems that maintained breathable air and drinkable water and stable temperatures had all broken down at once, and it would stay that way for a very, very long time. The extinctions didn't happen all at once. That's not how extinction events work, even catastrophic ones. What happened instead was a cascading collapse, ecosystem after ecosystem falling like dominoes, each failure triggering the next until the entire planetary biosphere stood on the edge of total annihilation. Let's start with the oceans, because that's where the dying reached its absolute worst. 96% of all marine species went extinct. Think about that number for a moment. Not 96% of individuals. 96% of species. Every unique form of life that evolution had crafted over hundreds of millions of years. Gone. If you could have walked the ocean floor during the height of the extinction, you would have found it carpeted with death. Shells piled meters thick. Reefs reduced to rubble. Waters so devoid of oxygen that nothing larger than bacteria could survive in them. The trilobites went first, or rather, they went last. These arthropods had been the success story of ancient oceans for 270 million years. They had survived 2 previous mass extinctions. They had adapted to every marine environment from shallow tropical seas to deep abyssal plains. They had diversified into thousands of species, each one a unique solution to the problem of survival in Earth's ancient oceans. By the time the Permian extinction began, they were already in decline, reduced to just a handful of species clinging to existence in specialized niches. The final trilobites lived in shallow marine environments along the coast of Pangaea. They were small, unremarkable species compared to their spectacular ancestors. But they were survivors. They had made it through 270 million years of planetary changes, climate shifts, and evolutionary competition. Then the oceans began to warm and acidify, and even these last holdouts couldn't adapt fast enough. We don't know exactly which trilobite died last. Maybe it was a single individual, crawling across the seafloor as the oxygen levels dropped below the threshold for survival. Maybe it was an entire population, suffocating together as hydrogen sulfide-laced waters swept through their habitat. What we know is that sometime during the main pulse of the extinction, the last trilobite died. 270 million years of evolutionary success ended not with a bang, but with a quiet cessation of existence in poisoned waters. The brachiopods, those lampshell, creatures that had filled the Permian seas with their diversity, suffered even worse than the trilobites. Over 90% of brachiopod genera disappeared. These were animals that had dominated seafloor communities for hundreds of millions of years, filter feeders that could thrive in conditions that would challenge most organisms. But filter feeding requires oxygen-rich water, and as the oceans lost their oxygen, the brachiopods suffocated en masse. Their shells accumulated in massive death assemblages, layers of calcium carbonate that would eventually become limestone beds marking the extinction boundary. The ammonoids, those spiral-shelled relatives of modern squid and octopuses, came devastatingly close to total extinction. They lost 97% of their diversity. From hundreds of species filling every marine niche, they were reduced to perhaps 2 or 3 lineages clinging to existence in isolated pockets of survivable water. These few survivors would eventually repopulate the oceans during the recovery period, but that was millions of years away. For now, they existed in numbers so small that finding a mate would have been challenging. The reef ecosystems collapsed completely. The Permian seas had been dominated by massive reef complexes built not by corals, which existed but were not major reef builders yet, but by sponges, algae, bryozoans, and various other organisms that had learned to construct communal structures. These reefs were biodiversity hotspots, home to thousands of species in relatively small areas. When the oceans acidified, reef-building organisms couldn't maintain their calcium carbonate structures. The chemistry of the water was working against them, dissolving shells and skeletons as fast as they could build them. The reefs died, and with them died all the species that depended on them for food and shelter. Sea urchins, which had been common in Permian oceans, were reduced to a single genus. Stalked echinoderms, those flower-like relatives of starfish, that had swayed in Permian currents for millions of years, lost over 90% of their diversity. The blastoids, another group of stalked echinoderms, went completely extinct. After 130 million years of existence, the last blastoid died sometime during the main extinction pulse. But perhaps the most telling indicator of just how bad things got in the oceans was the collapse of the food web itself. It wasn't just that individual species went extinct. The entire structure of marine ecosystems fell apart. In healthy oceans you have a pyramid of life. Abundant tiny organisms form the base, feeding progressively larger creatures in a hierarchy that culminates in apex predators. By the end of the Permian extinction, that pyramid had collapsed into something more like a pancake. The few surviving species existed at or near the bottom of the food chain. There weren't enough organisms to support complex ecosystem structures anymore. The evidence for this comes from something called body size reduction. Fossils from immediately after the extinction show that surviving species were significantly smaller than their pre-extinction relatives. This wasn't just a quirk of preservation. It was a signal that ecosystems had lost the productivity to support large-bodied organisms. Only small, fast-reproducing species could survive in the resource-depleted post-extinction oceans. On land, the dying was slightly less severe, but only slightly. About 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species went extinct. This might sound better than the 96% marine extinction rate, but remember that land ecosystems were much younger and less diverse than marine ones. Losing 70% of terrestrial vertebrates meant wiping out the majority of complex life on land. The large herbivores went first. These were animals like moschops, massive proto-mammals that had browsed on Permian vegetation like prehistoric cows. They disappeared as the plants they depended on died off. Without large herbivores, the predators that fed on them lost their food sources. The gorgonopsids, those saber-toothed proto-mammalian predators that had been apex predators of Permian ecosystems, went completely extinct. Every single species gone. The dicynodonts, those tusked proto-mammals that had been incredibly diverse and abundant, were reduced to just a handful of genera. From dozens of species occupying every terrestrial environment from swamps to semi-arid plains, they collapsed to small populations of a few surviving lineages. One of these survivors, a genus called Lystrosaurus, would become incredibly important in the recovery period. But during the extinction itself, even this resilient genus came perilously close to disappearing entirely. The therapsids, that great radiation of proto-mammalian synapsids that had dominated Permian landscapes, lost most of their diversity. These were animals that had evolved sophisticated features like differentiated teeth, upright posture, and possibly even fur and warm-bloodedness. They had been on an evolutionary trajectory that would eventually lead to true mammals. The extinction nearly ended that story before it could fully develop. The pariasaurs, those massive armoured herbivores that looked like combinations of turtles and rhinoceroses, went completely extinct. The captorhinids, an ancient group of reptiles that had been early colonizers of land, disappeared. The pelycosaurs, including the famous Dimetrodon with its distinctive sail, were already mostly extinct by the late Permian, but the few remaining species died out during the main extinction pulse. The forest ecosystems collapsed in ways that were perhaps even more devastating than the animal extinctions. Forests are the lungs of the terrestrial biosphere, producing oxygen, stabilizing soils, regulating water cycles. The Permian world had extensive forests of seed ferns, chordates and early conifers. As the climate destabilized and acid rain fell from polluted skies, these forests died on a massive scale. The evidence for this forest death is written in the geological record in a disturbing way. Fungal blooms. Normally fungi are a small component of the fossil record. They decompose organic matter, but they don't typically dominate ecosystems. During the Permian extinction, that changed. Fossil assemblages from this period show massive spikes in fungal abundance. In some locations, fungal remains are the only fossils present, creating what paleontologists call fungal spikes in the rock record. What this tells us is that dead plant material accumulated faster than normal decomposition could handle it. Entire forests' worth of vegetation died, creating vast amounts of rotting organic matter. Fungi, the only organisms equipped to break down wood and plant tissue at scale, exploded in abundance. For a period that might have lasted thousands of years, many terrestrial environments were dominated not by living forests, but by fungal blooms feeding on the corpses of dead ecosystems. The soil systems themselves broke down. Healthy soils require a complex community of organisms, from bacteria to fungi to invertebrates, all working together to process nutrients and support plant growth. When those communities collapsed, soils eroded rapidly without plant roots to hold them in place. Rivers carried massive sediment loads to the oceans, creating distinctive red beds in the geological record, layers of oxidized sediment that mark periods of severe soil erosion and environmental stress. The coal gap provides another line of evidence for the severity of terrestrial ecosystem collapse. Coal forms from accumulated plant material in swamps and wetlands. Throughout most of Earth's history, coal deposits are relatively common in the geological record. But there's a gap in coal formation that begins at the Permian Triassic boundary and extends for millions of years into the early Triassic. No coal means no extensive wetland forests, no accumulation of plant material. The environments that had produced coal for millions of years simply ceased to exist. The pattern of extinction on land shows clear selectivity. Large animals suffered more than small ones. This makes sense from an ecological perspective. Large animals require more food, larger territories, and more stable environmental conditions. When ecosystems are collapsing and food is scarce, being big is a liability, not an advantage. Complex food webs collapsed while simpler ones persisted. Specialists, animals adapted to very specific diets or environments, went extinct at higher rates than generalists who could eat a variety of foods and tolerate a range of conditions. Animals that lived in stable, complex ecosystems like forests suffered more than those adapted to harsher, more variable environments. But some lineages did survive, and understanding why tells us something important about the nature of survival during catastrophic environmental change. The survivors tended to be small, adaptable, and capable of tolerating harsh conditions. They weren't necessarily the most sophisticated or successful organisms of their time. They were the ones who could make do with less. Lystrosaurus, that small dicynodont proto-mammal, became incredibly abundant in the aftermath of the extinction. Fossil assemblages from the early Triassic show that in some regions, 95% of all vertebrate fossils are Lystrosaurus. This isn't because Lystrosaurus was particularly well adapted or competitive. It's because there was almost nothing else left. In a world of empty niches and collapsed ecosystems, a small pig-sized herbivore with generalist dietary preferences could spread across entire continents without competition. The cynodonts, a group of small proto-mammalian carnivores, survived in low numbers. These animals were important because they were the ancestors of true mammals. If the cynodonts had gone extinct, there would be no mammals, no primates, no humans. We exist because some small, rat-like cynodonts managed to survive when most of their relatives died. The archosaurs, ancestors of dinosaurs, pterosaurs and crocodiles, survived as small, probably semi-aquatic animals. In the Permian, they had been minor players in terrestrial ecosystems, occupying niche roles while proto-mammals dominated. The extinction changed that equation. With the proto-mammals devastated, archosaurs would eventually rise to dominance in the Triassic and beyond. Among plants, certain groups proved more resilient than others. Lycophytes, primitive spore-bearing plants that had been major components of Carboniferous forests, survived in reduced numbers. Some fern groups persisted, particularly those adapted to disturbed or harsh environments. Early conifers survived better than seed ferns, possibly because conifers were adapted to drier, more stressful conditions. But survival was highly regional. The extinction didn't hit everywhere equally. Some parts of Pangaea suffered more than others, creating a patchwork of devastation and relative refuge. The equatorial regions, already hot and dry in the Permian, became nearly uninhabitable. The combination of extreme heat, acid rain, and hydrogen sulfide eruptions from warming oceans created conditions that only the most resilient organisms could tolerate. Fossil assemblages from equatorial latitudes show almost complete ecosystem collapse. The few fossils present are almost exclusively Lystrosaurus and a handful of other disaster taxa, organisms that could survive but not thrive. Higher latitude regions, particularly in what is now Antarctica and Siberia, showed somewhat lower extinction rates. These areas started cooler and remained marginally more habitable as global temperatures rose. They served as refuges where some species could persist until conditions improved. But even in these refuges, ecosystems were devastated. The forests that had covered high-latitude Pangaea were replaced by scrubland and bare earth. Coastal regions suffered more than inland areas in some cases. The oceans were killing zones, and their deadly influence extended inland wherever hydrogen sulfide eruptions reached. Fossils from coastal deposits show evidence of multiple die-off events, suggesting repeated pulses of extinction as ocean anoxia waxed and waned. The fossil record from this period has a haunting quality. In rocks just below the extinction boundary, you find abundant, diverse fossil assemblages. Different species, different sizes, evidence of complex ecosystems with multiple interacting organisms. Then you cross the boundary, and that diversity collapses. In many locations, the immediate post-extinction rocks contain almost nothing. No bones, no shells, no plant fossils, just sediment and the occasional fungal remains. Where fossils do appear, they tell a story of survival at the absolute margins of possibility. The animals are small, usually less than a metre long. They show evidence of rapid growth and early sexual maturity, adaptations for reproducing quickly in unstable conditions. Their bones often show stress markers, lines of arrested growth indicating periods of severe malnutrition or environmental stress. The plants that survived show similar stress signals: reduced leaf size, simplified leaf structure, signs of damage from environmental toxins and acid rain. These weren't healthy ecosystems rebuilding. These were survivors hanging on by their evolutionary fingernails. The speed of the extinction is preserved in the rock record. In some locations, the entire biodiversity collapse happened within sediment layers representing just thousands of years, possibly less. This is geologically instantaneous. You can stand at an outcrop in China or South Africa, place one hand on Permian rocks full of fossils, and move your hand up a few centimetres to early Triassic rocks that are nearly barren. Those few centimetres of rock represent the collapse of an entire world. The severity of the extinction is measured not just in how many species died, but in how much ecological complexity was lost. The Permian world had sophisticated predator-prey relationships, complex food webs, specialised ecological roles filled by diverse organisms. The early Triassic world had almost none of that. It was ecologically simple, dominated by a few generalist species occupying wide but shallow niches. Paleontologists call this the dead zone, a period lasting millions of years when Earth's ecosystems remained devastated. Biodiversity was at its lowest level since the Cambrian explosion. The few species that existed were survivors, not thrivers. They persisted in a world that was hostile to complex life. The Great Dying earned its name. This wasn't just another extinction event. It was the closest life on Earth has ever come to complete annihilation. The oceans nearly became sterile, poisoned beyond the capacity of most organisms to survive. The land nearly became a desert, too hot and toxic for complex ecosystems. But life didn't end. It hung on, in isolated pockets, in marginal environments, in the genetic information carried by a few resilient species. The potential for recovery survived. The question was whether that potential could ever be realised, whether the damage done to Earth's biosphere could heal, or whether the planet would remain a toxic, nearly lifeless wasteland. The answer would take millions of years to emerge. The recovery from the Permian extinction would be the slowest in Earth's history, but it would come, slowly, painfully, against all odds. Life would find a way forward. The dying was over, but Earth wasn't recovering. Not yet. 252 million years ago, the Permian extinction had killed roughly 95% of all species on the planet. The eruptions had finally stopped. The oceans had stopped belching hydrogen sulfide into the atmosphere. The acid rain had ended. But the world that remained was fundamentally broken in ways that went far deeper than just counting dead species. Recovery from a mass extinction isn't like flipping a light switch. It's not even like healing from a wound. It's more like trying to rebuild an entire civilization after everyone who knew how things worked has died. The ecosystems that had existed before the catastrophe were gone. Not just the species, but the relationships between them. The predator-prey dynamics, the nutrient cycling patterns, the ecological networks that had taken hundreds of millions of years to evolve. All of it had to be rebuilt from scratch, and it would take 10 million years to do it. Think about that number, 10 million years. That's longer than the entire span of human evolution from our ape ancestors to modern civilization. That's longer than it took for life to recover from any other mass extinction in Earth's history. The extinction that killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, ecosystems bounced back in less than 1 million years. The late Devonian extinction that devastated marine life 375 million years ago, maybe 2 million years for recovery. But the Permian extinction created a world so damaged, so fundamentally disrupted, that life couldn't get its footing for 10 times that long. The question is, why? What made this recovery so impossibly slow? The answer is written in the rocks of the early Triassic period, and those rocks tell a story of a planet that kept trying to kill anything that survived. First, there was the heat. The Permian extinction had pumped so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that global temperatures had spiked by 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. That's bad enough on its own, but it also meant the heat didn't stop when the eruptions did. Carbon dioxide lingers in the atmosphere for thousands of years. Without healthy forests to absorb it, and without functioning ocean ecosystems to sequester it in deep sea sediments, those temperatures stayed elevated. The early Triassic was a furnace. Equatorial regions regularly hit temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot enough to denature proteins, to literally cook living tissue. Land animals couldn't survive at the equator. They were restricted to higher latitudes, narrow bands near the poles where temperatures occasionally dropped below lethal levels. Marine life faced similar constraints. Tropical oceans were essentially dead zones, too hot, too acidic, too depleted of oxygen to support complex life. The coral reefs that had dominated Permian seas? Gone. The diverse communities of brachiopods, bryozoans and crinoids that had covered the seafloor? Extinct. What remained were strips of marginal habitat at high latitudes where conditions were merely terrible instead of completely uninhabitable. Then there was the oxygen problem. The Permian extinction had devastated ocean circulation patterns. Without temperature gradients to drive currents, without seasonal mixing to bring oxygen to the depths, huge portions of the ocean remained anoxic, dead zones where nothing that breathed could survive. This wasn't temporary. The anoxia persisted for millions of years, expanding and contracting with climate fluctuations but never fully disappearing. Even worse, the anoxia kept spawning new episodes of hydrogen sulfide poisoning. Any time ocean circulation weakened, any time warming increased just a few degrees, the deep ocean would start producing that toxic gas again. The early Triassic is marked by multiple sulfur anomalies in the geological record, evidence that the oceans kept trying to kill whatever had managed to survive the initial catastrophe. The carbon cycle was broken too. Normally, weathering of rocks pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Rain falls, combines with CO2 to form weak carbonic acid, and that acid breaks down rocks, washing calcium and other minerals into the ocean where they eventually get locked up in limestone. It's a negative feedback loop that helps regulate Earth's temperature over geological timescales. But this process requires healthy ecosystems to work efficiently. Plant roots break up rocks, making them easier to weather. Soil microorganisms accelerate chemical reactions. Marine organisms use the dissolved minerals to build shells that eventually sink to the seafloor, locking carbon away for millions of years. In the early Triassic, all of these ecosystem services had collapsed. With most land plants dead and soil ecosystems devastated, weathering slowed to a crawl. With marine life reduced to simple, low-diversity communities, the biological carbon pump had essentially stopped working. Carbon dioxide that should have been pulled out of the atmosphere just stayed there, keeping temperatures high and preventing recovery. The result was a planet locked in what scientists call a recovery stall. Life couldn't recover because conditions were too harsh. But conditions wouldn't improve until life recovered enough to start fixing the broken biogeochemical cycles. It was a vicious circle that would take millions of years to break. But life didn't give up. It couldn't afford to. Even in the harsh conditions of the early Triassic, survivors began the long, slow process of rebuilding ecosystems from the ground up. On land, one creature dominated like nothing before or since, Lystrosaurus. If you walked across the supercontinent of Pangaea in the early Triassic, no matter where you went, from what is now Antarctica to Africa to Russia to China, you would encounter these creatures, Pig-sized herbivores with turtle-like beaks and powerful digging claws. For several million years, Lystrosaurus accounted for maybe 95% of all terrestrial vertebrate fossils. Think about that. Across an entire supercontinent, one type of animal dominated everything. It's like if the only mammal on Earth today was wombats. Just wombats everywhere you looked, from the Arctic to Australia. Scientists call creatures like this disaster taxa, species that thrive in the immediate aftermath of mass extinctions by being incredibly good at surviving terrible conditions. Lystrosaurus had won the apocalypse lottery through a combination of lucky adaptations. They could dig burrows to escape the worst heat and survive droughts. They could eat the simple, hardy plants that managed to grow in the devastated landscapes, possibly even roots and tubers that they excavated themselves. They could tolerate low oxygen conditions better than most other survivors. They bred rapidly and matured quickly, allowing their populations to expand even when conditions were harsh. But here's the thing about disaster taxa. They dominate because there's no competition, not because they're particularly sophisticated. Lystrosaurus weren't elegant solutions to the challenges of the early Triassic. They were brute force survival machines, good enough to persist when almost nothing else could. The problem was, as long as Lystrosaurus dominated, ecosystems couldn't become more complex. They weren't creating the ecological niches that would allow other species to evolve and diversify. They were keeping evolution stuck in survival mode. The oceans were facing similar constraints. In the Permian, marine communities had been incredibly complex. Hundreds of species of shell-bearing animals created diverse ecosystems with multiple trophic levels, specialized predators and prey, intricate food webs. After the extinction, all of that complexity collapsed. What emerged in the early Triassic were what paleontologists call flat ecosystems, simple communities dominated by just a few types of organisms, small bivalves, simple snails, some arthropods. They formed thin mats on the seafloor, low-diversity assemblages that were about as ecologically sophisticated as bacterial films. These weren't thriving ecosystems rebuilding themselves. They were ecological deserts where a few hardy generalists had figured out how to survive, and they persisted this way for millions of years. Geological. Sections from the early Triassic show the same simple communities appearing over and over again. Layer after layer of rocks containing basically the same fossil assemblages. It's the signature of an ecosystem stuck in a rut, unable to increase in complexity. But gradually, very gradually, things began to change. Around 247 million years ago, about 5 million years after the extinction, the first signs of recovery start appearing in the fossil record. Not a sudden explosion of diversity, not a rapid return to pre-extinction complexity, but tentative experiments, life trying new strategies, testing different approaches to survival. In the oceans, new types of predators started appearing. Not the massive apex predators of the Permian, but small to medium-sized hunters. Early marine reptiles, the ancestors of the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs that would eventually dominate Mesozoic seas. They were primitive and clumsy compared to their later descendants, but they were filling niches that had been empty since the extinction. Predator niches. This is crucial because predators are ecosystem engineers. They don't just eat prey, they regulate prey populations, preventing any single species from dominating too completely. They create selective pressure that drives prey species to evolve better defences, which drives predators to evolve better hunting strategies, which drives the evolution of even more sophisticated defences. It's an evolutionary arms race that increases ecosystem complexity and biodiversity. The appearance of marine predators meant food webs were starting to rebuild. Not quickly, not smoothly. But the process had begun. On land, something similar was happening. The Lystrosaurus monoculture was finally breaking down. New types of herbivores were appearing. rhynchosaurs, lizard-like reptiles with powerful jaws for processing tough plant material. Early archosaurs, the group that would eventually give rise to dinosaurs and crocodiles, were experimenting with different body plans and different feeding strategies. Most importantly, the archosaurs were trying something new. They were standing up. Literally. Most Permian and early Triassic land animals had sprawling postures. Their legs stuck out sideways from their bodies like modern lizards. This is an energy-efficient posture for slow-moving animals, but it limits how far and how fast you can move. Some archosaur lineages began developing more upright postures, with their legs positioned more directly under their bodies. This required more energy to maintain, but it allowed for faster, more sustained movement. It opened up new ecological possibilities: long-distance migration to escape harsh conditions, pursuit predation instead of ambush hunting, the ability to defend larger territories or access widely scattered resources. This postural shift might seem like a minor detail, but it was actually one of the most important innovations of the Triassic recovery. It set the stage for the eventual rise of the dinosaurs, the most successful group of land animals in Earth's history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because for millions of years, these early experiments didn't lead to dramatic diversification. The Middle Triassic, from about 247 to 237 million years ago, was a period of slow, grinding recovery. Diversity increased, but gradually. New species appeared, but most didn't last long. Ecosystems remained relatively simple and prone to collapse. The planet was still too unstable for complex specialized communities to establish themselves. Why? Because the fundamental environmental problems hadn't been solved yet. Temperatures were still high. Ocean anoxia was still recurring. The carbon cycle was still impaired. Earth needed more time to heal at a planetary level before life could really flourish again. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: plants. During the early and middle Triassic, land plants had been dominated by simple forms: ferns, seed ferns and horsetails. Tough, fast-growing species that could tolerate harsh conditions but didn't create complex forest ecosystems. Then, around 240 million years ago, a new group appeared: conifers. Modern conifers like pines, spruces and firs are familiar to us, but in the Triassic they were evolutionary innovations. They had several advantages over earlier plant groups. They could grow taller, creating multi-layered forest canopies. They were more efficient at water use, allowing them to thrive in the seasonal climates of Pangaea's interior. Most importantly, they produced massive amounts of organic matter. Fallen needles, branches, dead trees, all accumulating on the forest floor. This organic matter was crucial for rebuilding soil ecosystems. As it decomposed, it created habitat for fungi, bacteria and invertebrates. These organisms, in turn, accelerated rock weathering and nutrient cycling. Slowly, the carbon cycle began working properly again. Carbon dioxide started being pulled out of the atmosphere more efficiently. Temperatures began to drop, gradually moving away from the extreme highs of the early Triassic. As temperatures moderated, ocean circulation strengthened. Better circulation meant more oxygen reaching the depths. More oxygen meant anoxia retreated. Less anoxia meant fewer episodes of hydrogen sulfide poisoning. Each improvement made the next improvement more likely. The vicious circle of the recovery stall was finally becoming a virtuous circle of ecosystem repair. By the late Triassic, around 230 million years ago, Earth was finally starting to look like a functioning planet again. Diversity was increasing rapidly. Ecosystems were becoming more complex, and entirely new groups of animals were beginning their rise to dominance. The dinosaurs. They evolved from small archosaur ancestors during the Middle Triassic, but for millions of years they remained marginal. Small rare components of ecosystems dominated by other reptile groups. Then, starting around 230 million years ago, they began to diversify and expand. Within 10 million years, they would become the dominant land animals on Earth, a position they would hold for the next 165 million years. Their success wasn't accidental. Dinosaurs inherited all the innovations that archosaurs had been experimenting with during the recovery period. Upright posture for efficient locomotion, advanced respiratory systems with air sacs that made breathing more efficient, rapid growth rates that allowed them to reach large sizes quickly, the ability to regulate body temperature at least partially, allowing them to remain active in variable conditions. But more than that, they appeared at exactly the right time. By the late Triassic, ecosystems had recovered enough to support large, diverse animal communities, but they weren't yet dominated by specialised incumbent groups. There were ecological opportunities everywhere for animals with the right adaptations. Dinosaurs rushed into these open niches and diversified explosively. Long-necked sauropodomorphs became the first truly large herbivores since before the extinction. Theropods evolved into diverse predators ranging from small, agile hunters to massive apex predators. Ornithischians began experimenting with elaborate defensive structures and specialized feeding mechanisms. Within a few million years, dinosaurs had gone from evolutionary footnotes to the most successful group of land animals on the planet, and they would remain dominant for longer than any other terrestrial vertebrate group in history. But while the dinosaurs were beginning their reign, another group of survivors was taking a very different path. The mammals, or rather, the ancestors of mammals. They had evolved from therapsids, the same group that included Lystrosaurus and other early Triassic survivors. During the Permian, therapsids had been incredibly diverse. Some were massive predators, others were sophisticated herbivores with complex teeth and possibly even fur. The extinction had devastated this diversity. Only a few lineages survived, and they were all small. The group that would eventually give rise to true mammals, the cynodonts, barely made it through, but they did survive, and during the Triassic recovery, they began evolving features that would define mammals. More sophisticated teeth for processing different types of food, better hearing, with jawbones gradually transforming into the tiny bones of the mammalian middle ear, whiskers for sensing their environment, probably fur for insulation, possibly even lactation, allowing them to feed their young with nutrient-rich milk. These were remarkable innovations. In many ways, the cynodonts and early mammals were more sophisticated than the dinosaurs, but they remained small, shrew-sized to rat-sized creatures living in the shadows of the dinosaur world. For the next 150 million years, through the entire age of dinosaurs, mammals would remain, evolutionary overachievers stuck in ecological supporting roles. Why didn't they get larger? Why didn't they compete more directly with dinosaurs? The answer seems to be that dinosaurs simply did the large animal niche better. Their upright posture, efficient breathing, and rapid growth gave them advantages that mammals couldn't match, not with the body plans they had at the time. So mammals specialized for what they could do better than dinosaurs. Being small, being nocturnal, having sophisticated senses and complex behaviors, caring extensively for their young. They were playing the long game, developing the adaptations that would eventually, after the next mass extinction eliminated the dinosaurs, allow mammals to inherit the Earth. But that was still 165 million years in the future. For now, they were successful survivors of the Permian catastrophe, but nothing more. The late Triassic world was strange by modern standards. The continents were still fused into Pangaea, creating extreme continental climates. Massive deserts dominated the interior. Seasonal monsoons brought intense rainfall to coastal regions. The poles were ice-free, covered with forests of conifers and seed ferns, and the ecosystems were completely different from anything that had existed before the extinction. The coral reefs of the Permian were gone, replaced by reefs built by completely different organisms. Scleractinian corals, the group that builds modern coral reefs, evolved during the Middle Triassic. They weren't related to Permian corals. They had independently evolved the ability to build calcium carbonate skeletons and form reef structures. Evolution had found a similar solution to the same ecological problem, but it had to reinvent reef building from scratch. On land, the forests were dominated by conifers and other seed plants. The coal swamp forests of the Carboniferous and Permian, with their giant club mosses and horsetails, were gone. They would never return. The new forests were drier, more fire-adapted, creating different types of habitat and supporting different types of animals. In the oceans, the ecological structure was completely reorganized. Modern marine food webs, with their emphasis on pelagic, open ocean predators and complex planktonic communities, began developing during the Triassic recovery. Permian oceans had been focused on the seafloor, benthic communities, animals living on and in the sediment. The extinction had wiped out most of these groups and opened up the water column for colonization by new lineages. This wasn't just recovery, it was reinvention. The extinction had been so severe that evolution couldn't just rebuild what had been lost. It had to create fundamentally new ecosystems with different structures, different dominant groups, different ecological relationships. And here's the really profound thing. This pattern of reorganization set the template for modern biodiversity. The major groups that dominate today's ecosystems, dinosaurs, mammals, modern corals, modern reef fish, flowering plants, most appeared during or shortly after the Triassic recovery period. They were products of the extinction and its aftermath. Without the Permian catastrophe, without those 10 million years of experimental ecosystem rebuilding, the modern world would look completely different. By 220 million years ago, roughly 32 million years after the extinction, Earth had finally recovered. Ecosystems were complex and diverse again. The carbon cycle was functioning normally. Ocean oxygenation had returned to healthy levels. Global temperatures had moderated, though they remained warmer than the Permian average. Life had survived its greatest test. It had endured 10 million years of grinding recovery, experimenting with new forms and new strategies, until it found combinations that worked. The world that emerged was strange and new, but it was alive, vibrantly, diversely, unstoppably alive. The age of dinosaurs had begun, and in the shadows, small furry creatures were waiting their turn. The extinction had changed everything, and those changes would echo through deep time, shaping the evolution of life on Earth for the next 250 million years. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When you look at what happened 252 million years ago, when you really examine the mechanisms that nearly ended complex life on Earth, the parallels to our current situation become impossible to ignore. The Permian extinction wasn't caused by an asteroid. There was no cosmic impact, no sudden extraterrestrial intervention. It was caused by volcanic eruptions releasing massive amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere over thousands of years. Sound familiar? The Siberian Traps pumped out somewhere between 3 and 15 trillion tons of carbon dioxide. That's an enormous amount. Catastrophic by any measure. But here's what should keep you awake at night. Humanity is currently releasing about 37 billion tons of CO2 annually. We're on track to release a comparable amount of carbon to the entire Siberian Traps event, except we're doing it in mere centuries instead of millennia. Think about that for a moment. An event that nearly sterilized the planet released its carbon over perhaps 200,000 years. We're releasing a similar quantity in less than 500 years. The rate of change is what matters, and we're changing things roughly 100 times faster than the catastrophe that caused the worst mass extinction in Earth's history. But raw numbers only tell part of the story. The mechanisms matter. The cascading failures matter. And this is where the Permian extinction becomes less like ancient history and more like a user manual for planetary disaster, one we're currently following step by step. Start with ocean acidification. When the Siberian Traps released CO2, much of it dissolved into the oceans just like it does today. The chemistry is simple and unavoidable. CO2 plus water equals carbonic acid. The pH drops. The ocean becomes more acidic. In the Permian, this happened over tens of thousands of years. Marine organisms, especially those building shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate, struggled to maintain their structures. Coral reefs dissolved. Shelled creatures found themselves unable to build protective housing. The base of the marine food web collapsed. Today, we're seeing the same process accelerate. The ocean's pH has already dropped by 0.1 units since pre-industrial times. That might not sound like much, but pH is a logarithmic scale. A change of 0.1 units represents a 30% increase in acidity. Coral reefs worldwide are experiencing mass bleaching events. Shellfish hatcheries along the Pacific coast are failing because larval oysters can't form shells in increasingly acidic water. The chemistry hasn't changed in 252 million years. CO2 plus water still equals carbonic acid, and we're running the same experiment the Siberian Traps did, just faster. Then there's the warming itself. The Permian extinction saw global temperatures rise by 8 to 10 degrees Celsius over the course of the event. Some regions experienced even more extreme increases. The equatorial oceans, already warm, became virtually uninhabitable, pushing past 40 degrees Celsius in surface waters. Most marine organisms can't survive those temperatures. Their proteins literally denature, their cellular processes break down. The tropics became death zones. We're not there yet, not even close. Current warming is about 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. But we're moving in the same direction, and critically we're moving faster. The warming during the Permian extinction happened over tens of thousands of years. We've achieved our current warming in about 150 years. If we continue on our current trajectory, we could see 3 to 4 degrees of warming by 2100, just 75 years from now. That's not Permian-level catastrophe, but it's heading in that direction at a rate that makes the Permian warming look gradual. The really terrifying part, the tipping points. The Permian extinction wasn't just about CO2 from volcanoes, that was just the trigger. What killed the planet was the cascade of feedback loops that followed. CO2 triggered warming. Warming released methane from seafloor deposits. Methane amplified warming further, which released even more methane, which destabilized more carbon reservoirs, which killed more vegetation, which released more carbon, which intensified warming, which... You see the pattern. Once the cascade started, it became self-sustaining. The planet didn't need the Siberian Traps anymore. It was generating its own warming through interconnected feedback loops that fed on each other for hundreds of thousands of years. We're staring at the same tipping points today. Methane deposits in Arctic permafrost are beginning to destabilize. As temperatures rise, frozen ground that has held methane locked away for thousands of years is thawing. Methane, remember, is 80 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas over a 20-year period. Initial releases are still relatively small, but this is exactly how the Permian cascade began. Small releases that trigger more warming, that trigger larger releases that trigger more warming. The Arctic is warming twice as fast as the global average. Permafrost that has been frozen for millennia is turning into swamps and lakes. Methane bubbles are emerging from Arctic waters. We're not in runaway warming yet, but we can see the mechanisms starting to engage, like watching a car start to skid on ice in slow motion. You know what's coming, but you haven't hit anything yet. Ocean circulation presents another parallel. During the Permian extinction, warming disrupted the thermohaline circulation, the great conveyor belt that moves water and heat around the planet. When surface water becomes too warm or too fresh, it stops sinking. The circulation slows, or stops entirely. Without this mixing, the deep ocean becomes stagnant and anoxic. Oxygen levels plummet. Toxic hydrogen sulfide accumulates. The oceans turn purple with bacterial blooms and deadly to most complex life. Today we're seeing signs that major ocean currents are weakening. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which includes the Gulf Stream, has slowed by about 15% since the mid-20th century. This is the current that keeps Europe habitable, that moderates climate across the northern hemisphere. If it weakens significantly or stops, the consequences would be catastrophic. Northern Europe would experience severe cooling even as the planet warms overall. Weather patterns would destabilise. Marine ecosystems would collapse. We'd be recreating another element of the Permian cascade. But here's where the story gets more nuanced, and in some ways more hopeful. The Permian extinction also teaches us about resilience and survival. Not every species died. Not every ecosystem collapsed completely. The survivors tell us something important about what characteristics help life persist through catastrophic change. Small body size helped. Smaller animals need less food, less territory, less energy to survive. They can persist in marginal environments. They can hide in refuges. They can ride out disasters that would starve larger species. During the Permian extinction, the megafauna died first. The big impressive predators, the large herbivores, the dominant species that had ruled their ecosystems for millions of years. They required too much, too many resources that were no longer available. But small creatures, rodent-sized cynodons, tiny reptiles, modest amphibians, some of them made it through. Dietary flexibility helped. Specialists died. If you'd evolved to eat one specific plant or hunt one particular prey species, and that food source disappeared, you were doomed. But generalists, creatures that could eat a variety of foods, switch between plants and animals, scavenge when necessary, they had options. When the old ecosystems collapsed, they could pivot to whatever food sources remained. Freshwater organisms did better than marine species. Rivers and lakes fed by rainfall and runoff maintained more stable conditions than the oceans. While the seas became acidic, anoxic death traps, some freshwater environments remained habitable. Fish, amphibians, freshwater invertebrates, they experienced severe losses but not complete annihilation. The extinction rate in freshwater systems was perhaps 50%, terrible but not the 90 to 95% wipeout that occurred in the oceans. Geographic range mattered. Species that existed across wide areas, multiple continents, diverse climates, they had better odds than endemics restricted to small regions. If conditions became uninhabitable in one area, a widespread species might survive in another. Local populations could be wiped out, but somewhere, somehow, a refuge population might persist. These survival patterns aren't just historical curiosities, they're data. They tell us which species alive today are most vulnerable to rapid environmental change. Large-bodied animals with specialized diets restricted to small geographic ranges, they're the ones most at risk. And when you look at current conservation status, that's exactly what we see. Pandas eating almost exclusively bamboo in limited mountain regions. Vulnerable. Polar bears, specialised for hunting seals on Arctic sea ice that's rapidly disappearing. Vulnerable. Orangutans, dependent on specific rainforest conditions in shrinking habitats. Critically endangered. Meanwhile, species that fit the Permian survivor profile are doing relatively well. Rats, small-bodied dietary generalists, geographically widespread. They're thriving in human-altered environments. Coyotes, adaptable predators that can adjust their diet and behaviour to almost any situation. They're expanding their range across North America. Pigeons, capable of eating nearly anything and living anywhere humans live. They're more successful now than ever. The Permian extinction is teaching us which species to worry about most. And the lesson is clear. Specialists are in trouble. Endemics are in danger. Large animals dependent on specific ecosystems are at highest risk. These are the species that need immediate conservation attention, because they're the ones most likely to follow their Permian counterparts into extinction. But understanding the crisis isn't the same as understanding the solution, and this is where the Permian extinction delivers its most sobering lesson. Recovery takes an incomprehensibly long time. Even after the dying stopped, even after CO2 levels began to drop and temperatures started to stabilise, even after the immediate crisis had passed, Earth remained a diminished world for millions of years. Coral reefs didn't return for 10 million years. Complex marine ecosystems took 5 million years to reassemble. Terrestrial biodiversity remained depressed for at least 4 million years. Not all land. It took another 30 million years before ecosystems regained the complexity and diversity they'd had before the extinction. That's not just deep time. That's geological eternities, timescales so vast that they become almost meaningless in human terms. Think about it this way. The entire history of human civilization, from the first agricultural settlements to today, spans roughly 10,000 years. The time from the extinction of dinosaurs to the present is 66 million years, longer than it took Earth to recover from the Permian extinction. If a Permian-level catastrophe happened today, life on Earth would eventually recover. New species would evolve. Ecosystems would rebuild themselves. The planet would heal. But we wouldn't be here to see it. Our species wouldn't survive the event. And if somehow isolated human populations persisted through the crisis itself, they would live out their entire existence, potentially hundreds of thousands of years, on a diminished, simplified, impoverished planet. Their distant descendants, if any, might eventually inherit a recovered Earth, but only after timescales that make human history look like a brief flicker. This is the ultimate lesson of the Permian extinction. Earth will be fine. Life will persist. Evolution will continue. The planet has survived worse catastrophes than anything we can unleash. But the Earth that survives might not be one we'd recognise or could inhabit. The recovery happens on geological timescales that are functionally infinite from a human perspective. We don't get to see things return to normal because normal only returns millions of years after we'd be gone. So how do we know all this? How can scientists look at rocks from 252 million years ago and reconstruct cascading environmental disasters, tipping points, and recovery timelines that span millions of years? The evidence is written in stone, quite literally. And reading that evidence requires combining multiple disciplines, multiple lines of investigation that all point to the same terrible story. Start with the rocks themselves. Sedimentary layers laid down during the Permian extinction show distinctive signatures. At the extinction boundary, you see sudden changes in rock composition. Limestone layers, formed from the shells and skeletons of marine organisms, disappear or become much thinner. The ocean wasn't producing calcium carbonate because there weren't enough organisms building shells. You see changes in oxygen isotopes that indicate temperature shifts. Different ratios of oxygen-16 to oxygen-18 in fossil shells reveal ocean temperatures from millions of years ago. The Permian boundary layers show dramatic warming, sometimes more than 10 degrees, in what appears to be geologically rapid time. Carbon isotopes tell the story of atmospheric composition. Carbon-12 and carbon-13 ratios shift dramatically at the boundary, indicating massive inputs of organic carbon, the signature of either volcanic outgassing or methane, released from biological sources. The specific pattern of the shifts helps scientists distinguish between different carbon sources and understand the sequence of events. Sulfur isotopes reveal ocean chemistry. During periods of anoxia, when oxygen levels drop in seawater, sulfur gets processed differently by bacteria. The isotope ratios preserved in rocks show when and where oceans became oxygen depleted. Permian boundary rocks show widespread anoxia lasting for hundreds of thousands of years. Then there are the fossils themselves, or rather their absence. Paleontologists call it the Permian gap. Rock layers just below the extinction boundary are packed with fossils. Hundreds of species, diverse ecosystems, abundant life. Then suddenly, within a layer often just a few centimetres thick, most of them disappear. The layers immediately above contain drastically reduced diversity, maybe 10% of the species that existed before. And many of those survivors show what paleontologists call Lilliput effect. Temporary dwarfing. Animals becoming dramatically smaller during the crisis period, another signature of environmental stress. The fossil record doesn't just show which species died, it shows the sequence of extinction. Marine invertebrates went first, then terrestrial vertebrates, then insects, which almost never go extinct in large numbers. The pattern reveals a cascade, ecosystems collapsing in sequence as the disaster spread. Paleontologists also study fossilized pollen and spores. These microscopic structures preserve beautifully and tell the story of terrestrial plant communities. At the Permian boundary, pollen diversity crashes. Complex forests dominated by many tree species give way to simple communities of just a few opportunistic plants. It's the botanical equivalent of a weedy field replacing an old growth forest, and it persists for millions of years in the fossil record. Some of the most dramatic evidence comes from biomarkers, molecular fossils that preserve in rocks even when no actual fossils remain. Scientists can identify specific compounds produced by particular types of bacteria, including the purple sulfur bacteria that indicate toxic anoxic conditions. These biomarkers spike dramatically in rocks from the extinction period, physical evidence of the toxic ocean conditions. But here's what makes this science so compelling. Different research groups, studying different rock formations on different continents, using different analytical methods, all arriving at the same conclusions. The timing matches. The geochemical signatures align. The fossil evidence tells the same story. The physics and chemistry all make sense together. This isn't speculation. It's reconstruction based on multiple independent lines of evidence that all corroborate each other. Of course, scientists still debate the details. How much warming occurred and how fast? Estimates range from 8 to 12 degrees Celsius over timescales between 10,000 and 100,000 years. Was methane release from seafloor deposits the primary amplifying mechanism, or did carbon release from burning coal deposits play a bigger role? Did ocean acidification or anoxia kill more marine species? The debates continue because new evidence keeps emerging. New analytical techniques let scientists extract more information from old rocks. New fossil discoveries fill gaps in our understanding. Just in the past decade, researchers identified previously unknown feedback mechanisms, refined the extinction timeline, and discovered that the recovery period was even longer and more complex than previously thought. But the core story remains consistent. Massive volcanic eruptions triggered cascading environmental failures that killed most life on Earth and left the planet impoverished for millions of years. That story isn't in doubt. The details are being refined, but the fundamental narrative is solid, supported by decades of research and thousands of scientific studies, and it's a narrative that should inform how we think about our current situation. Because here we are, 252 million years later, running a similar experiment. We're releasing carbon at unprecedented rates. We're acidifying oceans. We're triggering feedback loops. We're pushing toward tipping points. The mechanisms are the same. The chemistry hasn't changed. The physics of planetary systems still work exactly as they did in the Permian. We have one advantage our Permian predecessors didn't have. We understand what's happening. We can read the warnings written in ancient rocks. We can see where this path leads because we found the signposts in geological history. The Permian extinction is showing us exactly what happens when you flood the atmosphere with greenhouse gases faster than Earth systems can compensate. It's teaching us about tipping points and cascading failures. It's demonstrating the incomprehensible timescales of recovery. Most importantly, it's proving that complex life on Earth is more fragile than we'd like to believe. Yes, life survived. Yes, Earth recovered. But it took millions of years. And the species that dominated before the catastrophe, the ones that had ruled their ecosystems for millions of years, never came back. They were replaced by entirely new lineages that evolved in the aftermath. If we continue down our current path, human civilization won't survive to see the recovery. Neither will most large animals, most specialized species, most of the biodiversity we consider normal. Earth will eventually heal, but it will heal without us slowly, over timescales that make human history irrelevant. That's the echo we're hearing from 252 million years ago, a warning carried through deep time, a message from a planet that nearly died, telling us that the mechanisms of mass extinction are universal. That atmospheric carbon doesn't care whether it comes from volcanoes or fossil fuels, that cascading feedback loops once triggered don't stop just because the initial forcing ends, that tipping points, once crossed, lead to destinations you can't return from on any timescale that matters to human civilization. The rocks remember, the fossils remember, the geochemical signatures remember, and they're all telling us the same story. We're not as separate from the Permian extinction as we'd like to think. We're echoes of that ancient catastrophe, potentially the first species in Earth's history capable of understanding the warnings from deep time and consciously choosing a different path. The question is whether we'll listen to the echoes or become one ourselves. So here we are, 252 million years after the night the Earth stopped breathing, after the Siberian Traps split open and remade the planet, after the oceans turned toxic and the atmosphere became poison, after 96% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates disappeared into the fossil record. After everything that could go wrong did go wrong, simultaneously, catastrophically, for hundreds of thousands of years. And yet, you're here listening to this. The Earth is still here, teeming with life. The oceans are full of fish. The forests are full of birds. The land is covered with mammals and reptiles and amphibians, all descendants of that tiny fraction of survivors who made it through the worst extinction event in planetary history. That's the first lesson from deep time. Life is extraordinarily fragile. A few volcanic fissures in Siberia, some unfortunate chemistry, and nearly everything dies. The entire structure of complex life on Earth, built up over hundreds of millions of years, can be dismantled in geological instants. The Permian world, with its massive amphibians and proto-mammal predators and bizarre sail-backed creatures, was completely erased, gone, replaced entirely. But here's the second lesson, the one that might help you sleep easier tonight. Life is also extraordinarily persistent. It doesn't give up. It finds a way. Even when 96% of species vanish, that remaining 4% carries forward. They survive in the hot springs and the deep ocean vents and the high mountain refuges. They wait out the toxic centuries, and then, when conditions finally stabilize, they explode back into diversity. The Triassic world that emerged from the Permian extinction was completely different from what came before. The creatures that inherited the Earth weren't the ones that had dominated before the catastrophe. They were the weird ones, the marginal ones, the species that had been hanging on in small numbers while the giants ruled. Among those inheritors were a group of small, unimpressive reptiles that had barely survived the Great Dying. Within a few million years, they would diversify into the most successful vertebrate group in Earth's history. The dinosaurs. They wouldn't exist without the Permian extinction. The catastrophe that killed almost everything created the opportunity for them to rise. That's how deep time works. Catastrophes that seem absolutely final from a human perspective are just transitions on geological timescales. The Earth has been through worse than anything we can imagine, and has come out the other side different, but alive, always alive. Think about that as you drift off tonight. The oxygen you're breathing right now, the air that fills your lungs with every breath, is the product of billions of years of biological engineering. Cyanobacteria creating the first oxygen, plants refining and maintaining the atmosphere, animals evolving to use it efficiently. Even the Permian extinction, catastrophic as it was just one chapter in that ongoing story. The planet has been frozen solid, covered in ice from pole to pole. It's been roasted under toxic skies while volcanoes remade continents. It's been hit by asteroids that made the Siberian Traps look gentle, and through it all, life has persisted. Not the same life. Evolution doesn't go backwards. The Permian world is gone forever. But life itself, that strange chemical phenomenon that started in some ancient ocean vent or tidal pool, continues. We're part of that story now. Modern humans, the descendants of our own near extinction just 900,000 years ago, telling stories about extinctions 252 million years in the past. That's an incredible perspective to have. No other species in Earth's history has been able to look back through geological time and understand its own place in the long arc of life's persistence. It's humbling, isn't it? Everything that seems permanent is temporary on geological timescales. Mountains erode, oceans move, continents collide and split apart, species rise and fall and are replaced entirely. The Earth doesn't care about individual species. It just keeps spinning, keeps changing, keeps providing the stage for whatever life can adapt to its current conditions. But it's also strangely comforting. The Earth has survived so much worse than anything happening today. It will still be here long after we're gone, probably hosting completely different forms of life, creatures as alien to us as we would be to those Permian amphibians. That's the nature of deep time. Everything passes, everything changes, everything persists in new forms. So as you close your eyes tonight, let yourself float back through those 252 million years. Picture the Siberian Traps erupting. Remember the toxic oceans and the struggling survivors. Think about the long recovery, the patient rebuilding of Earth's ecosystems over millions of years. Remember that you're part of a lineage that survived its own bottleneck, that carries forward the persistence of life through countless catastrophes. Before you drift off, if you've enjoyed this journey through deep time, take a moment to like this video. It helps others find these stories of Earth's ancient past. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight, what part of the modern Earth you're occupying while thinking about the ancient one, and subscribe if you want more explorations of prehistoric mysteries, more stories from those moments when everything changed. There are more mass extinctions to explore. The asteroid that ended the dinosaurs, the late Devonian crisis that nearly ended complex life before it really got started, the mysterious Ordovician extinction that we're still trying to understand. Each one is a story of catastrophe and resilience, death and renewal, endings that were also beginnings. But those are stories for another night. For now, rest easy. Breathe deeply. Every breath connects you to billions of years of planetary history. You're alive at the end of a chain of survival that stretches back through the Permian extinction and beyond, all the way to the first stirrings of life on a young planet. The Earth stopped breathing once, 252 million years ago, but it started again. Life always starts again. That's the lesson from deep time. That's the thought to carry you into sleep tonight. Sweet dreams from deep time. And remember, you're part of the longest story ever told.